picture the most elegant woman you've ever seen in a Victorian portrait. The one with the impossibly narrow waist and the enormous skirts and the perfect posture and the gloved hands folded in her lap and the expression of serene control that suggests she has never, in her entire life, experienced anything so common as discomfort. Now picture what's under the dress. 7 layers of clothing at minimum, a corset boned with actual whalebone, laced until the waist measures 21 inches, steel hoops or horsehair pads projecting the skirts outward to a circumference that can reach 12 feet, 3 petticoats, a chemise, gloves, tight leather shoes with 23 buttons each, a hat secured with 5 pins through the hair, which is itself held up with 20 more pins and requires a dedicated hour of assembly every morning. She is wearing, conservatively, 18 pounds of clothing, and at some point during the day recorded in that portrait she needed to use the bathroom. Not a metaphor. Not a vague, polite reference. The actual biological necessity of being alive in a body. The thing nobody discusses at afternoon soirées. Nobody includes in the etiquette books. Nobody paints into the oil portraits. That thing. And the system for dealing with that thing, while wearing everything I just described, while observing every social rule that governs what women in 1875 can acknowledge, do, ask for or admit to needing, is a story that has almost completely vanished from the historical record. But it happened every single day, to every single woman. I make these history stories and I genuinely don't know if anyone actually sleeps to an episode about Victorian undergarments, or if you're all just extremely curious people who need to understand exactly what was happening under those enormous skirts. Either way, get comfortable. This is going to permanently change how you look at every portrait of a Victorian woman you'll ever see. Here we go. Your name is Agnes Hartwell. You're 25 years old. You were born in Bristol in the autumn of 1850, the second daughter of a solicitor who had strong opinions about scripture and a weak relationship with financial management. And you've been in London for 3 years working as a companion to Mrs. Louisa Pemberton, widow of the late Alderman Gerald Pemberton, who died in 1872 of a liver complaint that everyone attributed to overwork and nobody attributed to the 3 bottles of port per week. Mrs. Pemberton is not an unkind woman. She's demanding in the specific way of people who've grown accustomed to having their complications managed by other people. And she occasionally forgets that you exist as an independent human being with your own requirements. But she pays you £40 per year and feeds you properly and provides you with a room on the 3rd floor of her house on Onslow Gardens in South Kensington, which is a better situation than many women of your position occupy. It is 6:43 on the morning of Thursday the 14th of October, 1875. You're standing in your room looking at the garments laid out on the chair by the window, and you are already tired. Not tired from lack of sleep. Tired in advance. Preemptively fatigued by the knowledge of what the day requires. Because today is Lady Whitmore's autumn soirée, and Lady Whitmore's soirées are the kind of events that require, as Mrs. Pemberton puts it, full armouring. And full armouring means you begin the process at 6:43 in the morning and you don't finish it until the last button is closed, which will be closer to 1:30 in the afternoon, because getting properly dressed in 1875 is not an act of minutes. It is a commitment. It is a structured programme. It requires another human being's assistance at multiple stages and produces in the wearer a sensation that is equal parts splendour and compression. The corset goes on first. It's lying on the chair like something between sculpture and practical architecture. 14 inches of cotton, and coutil, stiffened with a double row of steel bones and a single rigid busk running down the centre front. The bones are the real whalebone, the flexible keratin plates from the baleen of a bowhead whale, cut and shaped in a factory in Hull and ending up here in your hands on a Thursday morning in Kensington. The busk is steel. The fabric is cream cotton, well worn, softened by months of contact with your skin. It smells like what it is, a garment that has been worn against a human body for a long time, absorbing the particular combination of perspiration and talcum powder and the ghost of lavender sachet that constitutes the olfactory record of your daily life. You wrap it around you and hook the busk at the front. The hooks and eyes at the centre front click closed one by one, and the corset shapes itself to your body, or rather, to the shape it has decided your body ought to be. Your waist draws in. Your ribcage is collected upward. The boning presses gently at your sides, suggesting a posture that would take conscious effort to maintain without this structural assistance. The laces are at the back. You reach behind yourself and begin pulling them, the way you've been doing since you arrived in London and had to learn to dress yourself in this new level of formality without your mother's help. You can get them reasonably tight on your own. Not tightly enough for the 21-inch waist that fashion demands, but tight enough to function, tight enough to look respectable until Mary comes at 7 o'clock. Mary is the housemaid. She is 18, from County Clare, and has hands like someone who grew up doing farm work because she grew up doing farm work. She'll come upstairs at exactly 7 and finish the lacing, pulling the cords with her capable hands while you breathe out the way you've been trained to breathe out just before the final pull, because breathing in at the wrong moment costs you a 1/4 inch of compression, and you feel that 1/4 inch for the rest of the day in ways you would rather not. While you wait, you attend to the rest of the underpinnings. The chemise is already on. You've been wearing it since you got out of bed. A thin cotton shift that hangs from your shoulders to your mid-thigh and exists as a kind of mediating layer between your skin and the various structures that will be placed over it. Without the chemise, the bones of the corset mark you. Actual marks. Deep red channels pressed into the flesh along your sides and at your waist, visible at the end of a long day in the way that a road is visible through snow after someone has walked in it. The chemise softens this somewhat, not entirely. Over the chemise and under the corset cover, a lightweight garment like a blouse, designed to smooth the bulges of the bone structure and protect your outer dress from the warmth and moisture that accumulate underneath. Because warmth and moisture accumulate, this is not a comfortable truth, but it is an exact one. You wear a corset for 12 hours in an overheated Victorian drawing room, and the fabric beneath it is wet with your own body's honest response to the situation. The corset cover is laundered weekly. The chemise also. The corset itself, less frequently. The smell of a well-worn corset is specific. You know it the way you know the smell of your own room, so intimately that you've stopped noticing it unless something draws your attention to it. Sweat absorbed and dried and absorbed again. Talcum, lavender, the faint metallic edge of the steel bones. It is the smell of dressed. It is the smell of functioning. It is the smell of 18 months of putting this garment on in the morning and taking it off at night, and you have absorbed it so completely that when you finally remove the corset at the end of the day and the smell releases into the room air, you don't register it at all. Below the corset, where the fabric can still move freely, your drawers. This is where things get historically specific, and I want you to understand what I'm about to tell you. because it's the piece of information that makes everything else in this story make sense. Your drawers are not closed at the crotch. They're open, not by accident, not from wear. Open by design. Deliberately, intentionally, functionally open. The inner seam of a Victorian woman's drawers runs up each inner leg and then stops. The two legs of fabric attached at the waistband and hanging independently of each other simply do not meet in the middle. There is a gap, several inches wide, running from front to back that is stitched closed nowhere. This was true for virtually every pair of women's drawers manufactured in England from approximately the 1840s through the 1900s and beyond. Your mother wears split-crotch drawers. Your grandmother wore them. The Queen of England wears them. Every woman at Lady Whitmore's soirée this afternoon is wearing them, or will be, and not one of them will mention it, because the drawers are not a topic of discussion in any social context other than this one, which is you, alone in your room, getting dressed at 6:45 in the morning in 1875, and me explaining to you why the thing you're putting on your legs is the way it is. It's the way it is because the skirts. You cannot, physically, logistically, practically cannot, pull down the lower garments of a woman wearing a bustle and 3 petticoats and a trained outer skirt. Accomplish what needs accomplishing, and replace everything in any reasonable amount of time in any reasonable amount of space. The architecture of Victorian women's dress is elaborate at a level that makes elaborate seem insufficient as a word. It is structural. It is scaffolded. It is held in place by hooks and eyes and tapes and pins and the specific gravity of multiple layers of fabric, and unwinding that structure takes time and assistance, and a room large enough to accommodate the process, and nature, famously, does not wait. But you can crouch. You can gather your skirts, all of them, in both hands, lifted and swept backward so they clear the front of your body, and the split in your drawers does what it was designed to do. It creates a gap where the structure of your clothing would otherwise be an insurmountable obstacle. You crouch inside the tent your skirts create around you, and the mechanics work. That's the whole point. The design solves the problem. This solution has been in place for decades. It was here before you were born, before your mother was born, refined by generations of women who were wearing enormous skirts and needed to deal with the reality of living inside enormous skirts, and who solved the problem with the practical intelligence of people who have a problem that requires solving. Nobody in the fashion press discussed this. Nobody in the etiquette books mentioned it. Nobody painted it. But your aunt, who is a draper's wife in Bristol, and a practical woman who has worn everything from the full-cage crinoline of the 1860s to the current bustle construction, sat you down when you were 13 years old, and you were first trying on your cousin's cage crinoline, standing in the parlour feeling simultaneously architectural and absurd, and she said, "There are things you need to know about how to manage in this clothing. Let me show you." She showed you. You've never forgotten. The drawers are plain white cotton, not this morning's first white, but the comfortable washed grey white of clean laundry that's been cleaned many times. The waistband ties at the front. The legs reach to your knee, edged at the bottom with a narrow cotton lace that your mother sewed on herself, sitting at the Bristol window, finishing your undergarments with the same care she would give to something anyone would see. Because what you wear underneath matters even when, especially when, nobody will see it. The drawers go on, then a flannel petticoat closest to your skin, because October in London means the kind of cold that seeps upward through floors and sideways through windows, and warmth starts from the inside. The flannel is thick and slightly rough, and you love it with an uncomplicated love that has nothing to do with fashion. Then the bustle. You're living in the first bustle era. Technically, historical fashion distinguishes two bustle periods, 1869 to 1876 and 1883 to 1889, with a brief flat-fronted interlude between them. But in 1875, you're solidly in the first version, which is softer than what will come later. Your bustle is a construction of wire and horsehair and stiffened fabric, tied around your waist with tapes, sitting just below the level of the corset's lower edge at the back. It is roughly the size of a generous throw pillow, flat against your spine and projecting outward and slightly downward behind you, creating the shelf, the dramatic posterior projection, the specific silhouette that fashion currently requires. When you put it on, something changes. Your center of gravity shifts, not dramatically, but measurably. You feel it in the slight forward lean that your body automatically makes to counterbalance the weight behind you. You've been wearing a bustle for 3 years and the compensation has become unconscious. But in that first moment of putting it on each morning, you feel it. The reminder that your body and its scaffolding are not the same thing. Sitting in a bustle requires judgment. Standard dining chairs are designed for standard human bodies, and a standard human body sitting in a standard dining chair presses backward against the back of the chair, which is where the bustle is sitting, and the result is either the wire structure compressing in a way that's uncomfortable, or the chair's back receiving a stress it wasn't designed to receive. You've learned to perch, to sit at the front edge of whatever seat is available, back straight, weight balanced, the bustle projecting into the space behind you without pressing against anything. It looks like perfect posture. It is, in fact, a continuous minor physical negotiation. 3 petticoats over the bustle, 1 flannel, 2 cotton, layered for warmth and volume. The sound of the layering is specific. The soft percussion of cotton falling, settling, the slight rustle as the fabrics shift against each other. By the time the 3rd petticoat is on, you have a silhouette. The structure is assembled. What's left is the outer garment, the dress. Mrs. Pemberton lent it to you. She lent it with the specific generosity of someone who is doing you a favour she expects you to acknowledge, which you have acknowledged twice already and will acknowledge at least once more before the evening ends. It's been altered by Mrs. Pemberton's dressmaker to approximate your measurements. Your shoulders are narrower than Mrs. Pemberton's, your hips wider, your waist slightly smaller, and the alterations are visible if you know where to look. But in candlelight you can't see the differences in stitching, and Lady Whitmore's drawing room will be in candlelight by the time you arrive. The silk is peacock blue. Real silk, not the imitation satin that cheaper dresses are made from, and you can feel the difference in your hand when you lift it, the weight, the particular cool slipperiness of genuine woven silk, the way it moves with a liquidity that cheaper fabric can't replicate. It catches the morning light through the north-facing window and holds it, the colour deepening from one angle, lightening from another. The bodice has a high neck and long sleeves, and a fitted shape that achieves its fitted appearance by being constructed directly over the shape of a corseted body, rather than the shape of an actual body, which is why it fits you more precisely over the corset than it would over your uncorseted form. The buttons up the back are 23 small silk-covered buttons that require the specific hook tool hanging from your mirror frame to close, and which Mary will do in 4 minutes when she comes at 7, her fingers moving with the practiced speed of someone who has been buttoning small things since childhood. The skirt is gathered and draped at the back over the bustle, heavy with the weight of the silk, with a slight train that will collect the floor of every room you walk through today. By evening, the hem will be grey with accumulated dust and the particular fine grit of London floors that can never be entirely swept clean. This is expected. This is known. You don't mention it. Mary comes at 7. She pulls the corset laces from behind and you breathe out. Long, slow, controlled, giving up the air, letting your body reorganize itself into the tighter version of itself. The waist draws in further. You can feel each bone against your side as the fabric tightens, a sensation like being collected, being organized, being shaped into the correct form. Mary ties off the laces and you take a breath, shallower than a breath outside the corset, but enough. Your body has adapted. You've been doing this for years. Then the buttons. Mary's hands work down the centre back of the bodice while you hold still, feeling each small button secure itself into its loop, the dress closing over you from the neckline downward. The sensation is familiar. The gradual sealing of the outer layer, the body being placed inside its casing for the day. That's the lot, Mary says. Thank you. She picks up the tray she brought up with her and takes herself back downstairs. You turn to the mirror, £18, the peacock blue, the bustle in correct position, the skirts falling correctly, the bodice fitted with the exact precision that the dressmaker achieved through 4 hours of pinning and adjusting and repinning. You look like a woman of 1875. You look like the painting they never made, the one that shows everything that's actually happening, all the structure and engineering and planning, instead of the finished exterior with its illusion of effortless elegance. Right. Add the hat. Small, tilted, peacock blue with cream feathers, secured through the already assembled coil of your hair with 5 pins, the first 2 of which find purchase immediately, and the last 3 of which require several attempts. Add gloves. White kid leather to the elbow. Add the small beaded bag that contains nothing useful, a handkerchief, the hairpin case, a small bottle of lavender water. It has no room for anything else. You are dressed. Time to go downstairs. Breakfast is a calculation. You sit at the edge of the chair, front third of the seat, back straight, bustle projecting into the space behind, and you look at what's on the table and you make the assessment you make every morning. What can the corset accommodate, and how much of it, and what will the day actually require in terms of fuel? And how do you balance the two? The toast is fine. The tea is always fine. There are sausages and eggs, which you look at with the specific ambivalence of someone who has learned that eating enthusiastically in a tightly laced corset produces a very specific discomfort. The food has to go somewhere, and somewhere is currently compressed. A large breakfast in tight lacing sits like a stone in a bag that's already been cinched closed. You've made the mistake before of eating a full meal before a long event. You ate standing up for 2 hours afterward because sitting made it worse. You take 1 sausage, 2 pieces of toast. Mrs. Pemberton is at the table with the Times, which she reads with the concentration of a woman who considers herself well informed about world events and has very little access to sources beyond the newspaper. Agnes, she says without looking up, we leave at 2. Lady Whitmore keeps to 3 o'clock and she'll notice if we arrive late. I know. The blue suits you better than the brown. The brown makes you look like you work in trade. I'm wearing the blue. Good. She turns a page. Colonel Beatty is apparently attending. Just returned from India. The Beattys are a good family. You say nothing. He's about 30, Mrs. Pemberton adds. That's a reasonable age, you say. with the diplomatic care of someone who's learned to respond to these observations in ways that are neither encouraging nor dismissive enough to provoke further comment. Mrs. Pemberton looks at you over the newspaper. Her expression is that of a woman who has decided something and is willing to wait for you to catch up. "There's a piece here about enteric fever in Stepney," she says. "Another outbreak. Third this year. Something about the water supply." She says this the way she says all news that's somewhat unpleasant, at a conversational register, with the same tone she uses for weather and railway schedules, because Mrs. Pemberton has the particular ability of her class to discuss catastrophe at a remove as something that happens to other people in other neighbourhoods. But you think about it briefly while you finish your toast, about enteric fever, about the water supply, about the fact that in 1875 there are still parts of London where the sewerage infrastructure that is supposed to be protecting public health from waterborne disease has not yet arrived, where cesspits still collect what the population produces and water sources still draw from the same ground into which those cesspits leak, and where the resulting pattern of illness follows a map that any public health official can read, but that no newspaper in South Kensington discusses with any particular urgency. You have enough education to understand the connection. Not everyone does. Not everyone is meant to. You finish the tea. One more cup, a calculation, and you take it. Water goes in, water comes out. The timing of the out is something you'll need to manage between here and Lady Whitmore's house, and back again, and the management starts now with this cup, with the conscious awareness that the afternoon is approximately 6 hours long, and the facilities at Lady Whitmore's may or may not be sufficient for 40 guests. This is the background calculation, the one that runs beneath everything else, the one that no etiquette book addresses, because the etiquette books were written in the same social world that requires you to pretend the calculation isn't happening. It is happening. It has been happening every morning since you were 13 years old and first learned what managing a full day in an enormous skirt actually entails. Before you leave the house at 2 o'clock, there is a sequence of events. The morning work comes first. Mrs. Pemberton's correspondence, which is considerable and requires a clear head and a good hand. 3 letters that want replies, one of which is a delicate negotiation about a dinner engagement she accepted and now regrets. You write them at the small writing table in the morning room, the October sun coming through the south-facing window between 10 and 11 and making the room almost warm. Your posture is impeccable. The corset doesn't allow otherwise. At 11, Mary brings tea and a small plate of biscuits, and you take a short break and look at the garden, and you eat the biscuits carefully, and you drink 1 cup of tea and not a second. At 1 o'clock, you go upstairs, and before you go anywhere else, before you check your hair in the mirror or pick up your gloves or adjust the position of the hat, you go to the water closet on the upper landing. Mrs. Pemberton's water closet was installed in 1871, and it represents for the neighbourhood of Onslow Gardens at that time a genuine luxury. A china bowl, a mahogany seat, the chain pull mechanism that releases water from the cistern above, a mechanism that still seems to you faintly miraculous in the way that reliable conveniences seem miraculous to people who grew up without them. The whole connected to the new sewer line that runs under the street, which connects to the great intercepting sewers that Bazalgette built under London between the 1860s and 1870s, which replaced, not completely, not everywhere, but in this neighbourhood, in this street, the old system of cesspits and soil carts, and the particular relationship between London's waste and London's water that had been killing Londoners for centuries. You do what you need to do. The mechanics. You gather the skirts first, all of them, both hands sweeping upward and backward, the petticoats and the outer silk of the dress, gathered and held behind you. The bustle presses into the small of your back at an angle that isn't comfortable but is manageable. The split in your drawers does its work. You sit, or crouch, depending on the space, and nature takes its course. Then, lower the skirts carefully, in sequence. Outer layer first, making sure it falls straight. Petticoats next. Check that nothing is caught in the bustle's wire structure, which has a way of snagging if you're not paying attention. Wash your hands at the basin. Check yourself in the small mirror. This is what dressed women did every morning in 1875. This is the actual morning routine. The one that doesn't appear in the fashion plates in the novels where heroines wake up and immediately begin having feelings. The real sequence: wake, chamber pot in the darkness before dressing, water closet after, then the 18 pounds of clothing, if you have a water closet, which not everyone does. The chamber pot has been a domestic technology for approximately as long as indoor domesticity has existed. In its simplest form, a ceramic vessel, round, with a handle, large enough to serve its purpose, kept under the bed or in the cabinet beneath the washstand or behind a small curtain in the corner of the bedroom, used at night when the privy was at the bottom of the garden in the cold dark, and getting there in your nightgown was more than you were willing to consider. Used in the morning, before the dressing ritual began and made the process complicated. Used wherever the water closet wasn't. There is one under your bed. There is one under Mrs. Pemberton's bed. There is one under the bed in every bedroom in this house, because even a house with a proper water closet still generates the need at 3 a.m, when the landing is cold and the water closet is 4 doors down. The chamber pot is the honest solution to the problem of being human at 3 a.m. It asks nothing of you except that someone else deals with it the following morning. That someone else is Mary. Mary empties the chamber pots. She does this every morning, with the same practical efficiency she brings to everything, carrying them to the sluice room at the back of the house and cleaning them and returning them to their positions. It takes about 20 minutes for the whole house. It is not mentioned. It is simply done. It is part of the infrastructure of domestic life that makes the polished exterior of 1875 household management function without visible mechanism, the way the sewers under the streets make the street above them clean without anyone having to think about it. Someone always thinks about it. Someone always does the work. Mrs. Pemberton is in the hall when you come down at 1:30, already in her coat, already wearing the burgundy hat with the cream feathers that she's worn to every social event since 1873. The hired brougham is already at the door. Getting into a brougham in a bustle is, like most things in a bustle, a matter of technique. You go in first. The companion always enters first, positions herself on the backward-facing seat, which means managing the bustle through the carriage door opening. The door is not wide. The brougham is not spacious. You have learned to angle through sideways, gathering your skirts at the front and allowing the bustle to clear the door frame as you turn, and then you're in, and you settle onto the seat, front of the cushion, back straight, skirts arranged to minimize creasing. Mrs. Pemberton enters after you, more gracefully because she's had more practice, and the coachman closes the door and the carriage moves off into the October afternoon. London outside the window, Onslow Gardens to Old Brompton Road to Sloane Street. The usual October traffic, cabs, carts, pedestrians, the occasional private carriage with liveried coachman marking the occupants as several levels of prosperity above hired broughams, the October smell of the city coming through the gaps in the carriage door. coal smoke, leaves, something baking in a shop somewhere. The baseline smell of 600,000 people living close together that you've stopped consciously registering, but that is always faintly there. Mrs. Pemberton discusses during the journey the likely social territory of Lady Whitmore's soirée. Who will be there? In what configuration? What conversations will need to be navigated? What Mrs. Pemberton hopes to achieve and what she hopes to avoid. You listen and you file the information. This is also your job, knowing the social map well enough to help Mrs. Pemberton navigate it, being aware enough of the players and their relationships to place yourself correctly in any given conversational landscape. The Cavendish girl will be there, Mrs. Pemberton says. Second season. Be kind to her if she looks lost. Of course. And avoid Mr. Haswell. He talked about municipal drainage for 40 minutes at the Flemings, and I've never recovered. You think of Mr. Haswell and his 40-minute drainage discourse with something approaching sympathy. Not for Mrs. Pemberton, who doesn't want to hear about drainage. For Haswell, who apparently finds drainage genuinely interesting and has no audience for it in the drawing rooms of South Kensington, you would have listened. You're interested in how things work, how the infrastructure of a city functions at the level below its visible surface. But you've also learned which interests are welcome in which company, and municipal drainage at a social soirée is not something Mrs. Pemberton's world considers appropriate, which is, given the connection between municipal drainage and the enteric fever in Stepney that she read about this morning, a kind of irony. But here is Belgrave Square, and the lime trees with their bare October branches, and the fourth house from the corner where Lady Whitmore lives, inside, the hallway, the flowers, chrysanthemums, white and deep yellow, and the specific burnt amber of autumn chrysanthemums, massed in porcelain vases on either side of the staircase, and their smell hits you as you come through the door. The sharp, slightly bitter sweetness of chrysanthemums, which is not the sweetness of roses or lilies, but something more astringent, more autumn, more honest. Over the flowers, warm wax from a great many candles, under everything, the warm enclosed smell of a house that has been heated for 40 people, every fireplace contributing, the whole thing creating an ambient temperature several degrees above the October afternoon outside. You hand over your coat. The drawing room is up 3 steps and to the right, and you can hear it before you see it. The particular sound of approximately 35 people engaged in polite conversation, the murmur of it, the occasional precise laugh. Lady Whitmore is at the far end, white-haired, narrow, wearing grey silk with lavender trim, standing with a teacup with the stillness of someone who has been receiving guests in this room for 30 years and has long since stopped needing to move in order to observe everything happening in it. She spots Mrs. Pemberton with the accuracy of a woman whose guest management is professional grade. She spots you a fraction of a second later, and you see the brief, barely perceptible assessment that categorizes you, and places you and moves on. You've been assessed in this way many times. You know what it means. It means companion, not principal. Present, but not the point. You take your position slightly apart from Mrs. Pemberton, visible if needed, absent otherwise, and you do your own assessment of the room. 40 people. The room is Georgian proportioned, high-ceilinged, good natural light from the tall windows, though the October afternoon is already beginning to angle toward dusk. Settees and chairs in conversational groupings, small tables, maids circulating with trays, and you do the calculation you do at every event. One retiring room, That was the information from the maid you spoke to. First floor landing, second door on the right. One room for 40 women for a gathering that will last 3 to 4 hours. You file this information. You note the distance from the drawing room to the stairs. You make the instinctive assessment of queue time risk that you've been making at every social engagement since you learned, early in your employment, that this is information you need before you need it. A woman appears at your elbow, 35 or so, brown hair arranged in the slightly settled way of someone who started the day with ambitions toward fashion and ended up with functionality. She has the look you've learned to recognize across 3 years of drawing rooms. Another companion. "You're Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Pemberton's?" "I am. You're—" "Frances Sutton. I look after Mrs. Holland." She gestures toward a substantial woman in dark green near the fireplace. 8 years. "Agnes Hartwell, 3 years. She accepts a cup of tea from a passing maid, looks around the room with the surveying eye of professional experience. "Did you ask about the retiring room?" "First floor, second door on the right. One room for the lot of them as far as I can tell," Frances nods. "I brought my own pins." This is exactly the right thing to say, and you want to tell her so. So did I. She looks at you with a quick warmth of shared professional recognition. The specific warmth of finding someone who has been solving the same problems by the same methods, who has the same kit in their beaded bag, and has been counting the same odds since before they took their coat off. "Lady Cartwright's garden party last March," she says. 200 guests, one retiring room. I was in queue for 25 minutes, and that was near the front. "What did the women toward the back do?" She pauses. "There was an orangery." You look at her. She looks back. The orangery. Yes. You understand the orangery. Because this is the other method. The one your aunt told you about. The shooting party in Derbyshire. The all-day outing with no provision. The women who organised themselves into pairs and went 2 by 2 into whatever coverage the landscape offered. The hedgerow method, the copse of trees method, the large garden method. The method that has no name and leaves no record but that has been in practice, shared between women who needed it, for as long as women have been required to spend long periods in outdoor or semi-outdoor spaces without adequate facilities. The large skirt is the key. This is the thing that the enormous, ridiculous architecture of Victorian women's dress does, accidentally, or perhaps not accidentally. It creates cover. A woman in a full crinoline, or a bustled gown crouching in a secluded corner of a garden is functionally concealed from behind and both sides by approximately 12 feet of fabric held outward by either hoops or layered petticoats. If her companion stands with her back to the concealed direction, the pair of them require only a modest corner, a garden wall, a winter hedge to achieve what an indoor facility would otherwise provide. It doesn't appear in the letters about garden parties. It doesn't appear in diaries or social columns or etiquette manuals. But women who have been to enough garden parties know about the orangery. "Mrs. Holland needs a chair," Frances says, coming back to the practical present. "I can see she's been standing too long. Excuse me." She moves off. You take her place by the window. The afternoon moves through its social machinery. You speak to a colonel's wife who has opinions about the subcontinent derived entirely from illustrated newspapers. You speak to a second-season girl who is nervous in the specific way of someone who understands that she is being evaluated and hasn't yet learned the skill of being evaluated calmly. You speak to an older man connected to the Eastern Railway Company who begins discussing municipal drainage and for whom you feel genuine intellectual sympathy, but with whom you conduct a conversational retreat at the rate Mrs. Pemberton's expression indicates is necessary. At 4:30, the first genuine necessity of the day makes itself known, not urgent, not yet, but present. The conversation of your body making itself audible beneath the conversation of the drawing room. You make your way toward the door. This requires navigating the room, excusing yourself from conversations in progress, managing the bustle through the spaces between clusters of guests, being aware at all times of where the train of your skirt is relative to other people's feet. A social navigation that runs in parallel with the physical navigation. Smile here, nod there. The small social signals that mean excuse me without requiring you to say why. The hallway, the stairs require you to lift the skirt and train slightly at the front to avoid stepping on it, while managing the momentum of the bustle behind you, while keeping your hand on the banister for the balance you've learned you need on staircases in this configuration. 3 steps up and to the right and you're at the landing. First floor, second door on the right, the retiring room. A dressing table with a mirror and a selection of items for repair and maintenance. Hairpins in small china dishes, a dusting of face powder in a silver container, a cloth for applying it, small scissors, a bottle of lavender water. Behind a screen, the water closet, with a blue-flowered china bowl and a properly functioning chain pull mechanism, a washstand, the smell of rose water, and, underneath it, the more honest smell of a small room used by many people. 2 women already here. You wait. The first woman at the mirror rearranges hair with the efficiency of long practice. 40 seconds, no more, and she's done. The second emerges from behind the screen and shakes out her skirts with a specific gesture you recognize. Both hands lifting the fabric and releasing it so the layers fall correctly. A quick check that nothing is caught in the bustle's wire, a smoothing at the front. She goes to the washstand. You go behind the screen, the water closet, the gathered skirts, the split drawers, the mechanics of the thing, executed without thought because you've executed them more times than you could count. You think briefly while you're here about the design, about the specific genius of it, about the woman. Women surely. The solution was refined by women who worked out that the open seam in the drawers, combined with the gathered skirts technique, solved the fundamental problem. You think about who taught whom, how the knowledge travelled. Your aunt taught you. Someone taught your aunt. The knowledge is encoded in the making of the garments, in every pair of split-crotch drawers that comes out of the shops. The solution is embedded in the design, but the knowledge of how to use the design correctly, how to manage it, what the order of operations is, that knowledge is oral, transferred between women, taught privately. It appears nowhere in the public record. Lower the skirts, smooth the outer layer, check the bustle position, yes, sitting correctly. Wash your hands, check the mirror, you go back downstairs. At 5 o'clock, Lady Whitmore calls for music. The room settles. People find seats. The young woman at the Broadwood piano begins to play. Something by Schumann, you think, though you're not certain. The tune is familiar in the way of things you heard in Bristol, in the parlour, your sister at the piano. You stand near the back wall because standing is better on the corset than sitting for extended periods, and your feet have moved from comfortable into the early stages of the long ache that narrow leather shoes produce after 4 hours. You stand and you listen and you watch the room. 40 women in this room, give or take. Every single one managing the same basic problem. You can't tell, looking at them, at the burgundy and the green and the blue and the grey silk, at the perfect posture that corsets enforce, at the gloved hands and the composed faces. You can't tell who's been to the retiring room and who hasn't yet, and who is beginning to make the calculation you made an hour ago. The social surface is impeccable. The drawing room provides nothing visible, and this, you think, this is the true meaning of that social surface. Not just elegance, not just wealth displayed. The surface of a Victorian drawing room is a management system. It manages the gap between what human bodies actually do and what polite society pretends human bodies do. It manages it through architecture, the retiring room, the screen behind which the water closet sits, and through convention, the language that replaces direct reference with euphemism, and through clothing, the design of the open drawers that makes the management possible, and through the network of knowledge that women share with each other about how all of these management systems work. It is, if you look at it directly, a quite extraordinary achievement. The amount of coordination required to maintain the fiction of serene feminine elegance across the course of a 4-hour soirée, all of it invisible, all of it managed without acknowledgement, is a kind of collective performance that would be frankly impressive if its necessity weren't slightly ridiculous. You're thinking this when something happens on the other side of the room. A young woman you don't know, maybe 20, dark-haired, in a rose-pink dress that's her best, you can tell by the way she's wearing it, is standing in conversation with a group near the fireplace. Lady Whitmore, an older woman you don't recognise, and the Colonel's wife you spoke to earlier. The group is animated. Lady Whitmore is telling some story. The older woman is laughing. The Colonel's wife is nodding. The young woman in pink is smiling in the correct way and contributing the correct expressions at the correct intervals, and if you weren't looking for it, you would never see it. The minute tension around her eyes, the barely perceptible shift of weight from foot to foot. The way her smile has gone very slightly fixed, in the way a smile goes when holding it is requiring more effort than a smile should require. You've seen this before. You know what this is. She needs to get to the retiring room and she's trapped in conversation with Lady Whitmore, who is the hostess, who is mid-story. And leaving Lady Whitmore mid-story is a social impossibility of the first order. You don't walk away from Lady Whitmore while she's talking. Not on her own drawing room floor, not if you want to be invited back. And this young woman, in her best pink dress, at a Lady Whitmore soirée that is probably a significant occasion in her social year, very much needs to be invited back. The minutes pass. The piano continues. Lady Whitmore's story continues. The tension around the young woman's eyes tightens a fraction. You watch for another moment, confirming what you think you're seeing. Then you set down your teacup and you cross the room. You don't make a direct line to the young woman. That would be too obvious, would draw attention. You move in a slight arc, pausing once to examine a painting on the wall that you have no particular interest in, arriving at the edge of the group near the fireplace at an angle that looks casual. Lady Whitmore doesn't pause. She wouldn't pause for the arrival of someone at the periphery of her audience, but her eyes flick to you, register you, accept you as a legitimate addition to the group. You take a position just behind the young woman, very quietly, low enough that only she can hear. There's someone asking for you in the hallway. She turns. Her face opens into relief so immediate and complete that you understand exactly how urgent the situation had become. "I beg your pardon," she says to Lady Whitmore with the practised smoothness of a young woman who has learned how to interrupt without appearing to interrupt. "I believe I'm wanted for a moment. Please excuse me." And she's out of the group, out of the room, in the hallway and then up the stairs, And you watch her go, and you turn back to the painting you're pretending to examine, and you feel the specific satisfaction of having solved a problem neatly. Lady Whitmore's story continues. The Colonel's wife nods. The piano plays. Nobody noticed. Or almost nobody. Frances Sutton, from her position across the room, catches your eye and raises an eyebrow by approximately 1 millimetre. You give an equally minimal nod. She looks back at Mrs. Holland. This is the Women's Network. Not organised, not formal, not named. Just the accumulated intelligence of people who have been navigating the same terrain long enough to recognise when someone else needs help navigating it, and who help quietly, because the help is necessary and because the silence around the necessity means that the help has to come from somewhere. You go back to your position by the window. Your feet ache. The young woman returns from upstairs about 10 minutes later. Composed, correct, the tension completely gone from around her eyes. She finds a seat near the piano and listens to the music with the particular quality of relief that passes, in public, as simple attention. She doesn't catch your eye. There's no signal between you, no acknowledgement, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging what it was, which the social rules prohibit. But as she settles into her seat, she touches the back of her neck briefly with one gloved hand. The specific gesture of someone checking their hair is still in order, and in doing so she angles very slightly in your direction, and the angle is enough. You look at the window. Lady Whitmore's October garden in the evening light. The piano finishes. Applause. The company shifts back into conversation. Fresh tea appears. Another round of the social machinery, well maintained. You speak with the Colonel again, Colonel Beatty, just back from India, who asks about your reading of the administrative situation there, with the slightly baffled air of a man who does not often encounter women who have read about the administrative situation there. Mrs. Pemberton observed from 2 yards away. Her expression says, better, but dial it back just slightly. You dial it back just slightly. At 6 o'clock the gathering begins to thin. The early dinner guests leave. Lady Whitmore's goodbyes are precise, warm, professionally calibrated to make each departing guest feel that their departure is regrettable. Colonel Beatty, leaving, says something to Mrs. Pemberton that makes her nod, in a way that she will tell you about later, in the carriage. You help Mrs. Pemberton with her coat, you collect her bag, you follow her out. The October night hits you in the face as you step out of the door, and it is, after 4 hours in a heated drawing room under 18 pounds of clothing, extraordinary. Cold and sharp and coal-smoky and free. You breathe it in. As much of it as the corset allows, which is less than you'd like, but still, the cold on your face, your throat, your hands where the gloves end at the wrist, the brougham, the backward-facing seat, the wheels on cobblestones. Colonel Beatty asked about you, Mrs. Pemberton says when the carriage is moving. You wait. He asked if you'd be at the Cartwrights next Thursday. You look out the window at Sloane Street in the evening. I told him we might be, Mrs. Pemberton says. Mrs. Pemberton? Think about it, she says. And then she leans her head back against a carriage seat and closes her eyes. The wheels turn, the city goes past. The distance between Belgrave Square and Onslow Gardens is not very far, but the carriage takes its time. And in the time it takes, London presents itself. Lamplight on wet cobblestones, the shape of people moving in the evening, shops with their windows still lit. The sounds of the end of a Thursday. Carts heading home. the particular quality of sound that cities make when the working day is done but the evening hasn't quite begun. Home. Mary opens the door before you reach it. The house's warmth comes out to meet you. Coal fire, something kept warm in the kitchen, the specific enclosed domestic smell of a house that's been lived in all day. You come in out of the October. Mrs. Pemberton goes upstairs. You follow, because your room is above hers and because the end of a social event sometimes requires the kind of attendance that isn't assistance exactly, but is presence. Someone nearby who asks nothing and will help if needed. You help with her coat. Mary appears and begins the unbuttoning of Mrs. Pemberton's dress. You set out the cold cream, the hairpin tray, the dressing gown. Then you go up to your own floor. You sit on the edge of your bed, carefully, still in the bustle, the muscle memory of the day persisting. And you reach down and you take off your shoes. The relief. 6 hours, those shoes. 6 hours of narrow leather around feet that are not narrow. The act of removing them is one of the small daily miracles that only people who wear the wrong shoes ever fully appreciate. The blood returning, the bones separating back to their natural positions, the tingling rush of circulation. You flex your toes against the cold floorboards. Mary comes. The buttons undone, the hooks opened, the dress off, the petticoats off. 1, 2, 3, released and set aside. The room fills with the soft sound of displaced fabric. The bustle untied, removed, handed to Mary. You feel the shift in your centre of gravity as it goes, your body reclaiming its natural balance. Then the corset. Mary unties the laces from behind, then the busk at the front, click, 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 each hook releasing, and the corset opens and you breathe. A real breath from the diaphragm, the whole capacity of the lungs expanding outward in every direction without meeting resistance, the ribcage returning to its natural volume. The flesh at your waist releasing, re-expanding, reassuming its actual width. There is no precise equivalent in the modern experience for what this feels like if you've never worn a corset for 12 consecutive hours. The nearest thing might be, imagine you've been holding something in, somewhere in your torso, throughout an entire day. Not completely. You could breathe, you could function. You were unaware of it most of the time, but held slightly, continuously, and now you've released it. That release, distributed across your entire rib cage and waist. That. Thank you, Mary, you say. Night, miss. She takes the corset and goes. You stand in the cold room in your chemise and your split drawers. The 18 pounds removed, the structure gone, and you look at yourself in the small mirror. 25 years old, Bristol origin, London current, 3 years in service, 1 pair of feet that hurt, 1 day managed. You pull the hairpins out one by one. The whole collection, 20 or more, the infrastructure of the hair construction that held all day. Your hair falls. You shake it. It falls around your shoulders in the way hair falls when it's been up for 12 hours and released. Not gracefully, but with a kind of exhausted gratitude. You wash at the basin, face, neck, arms. The water is cold and slightly brown. The London water, filtered but not softened. And it is extraordinary on your skin after the accumulated warmth of the corseted day, under the arms especially. This is also not in the portraits. Chamber pot, then the flannel nightgown from Bristol, blue, long-sleeved, warm, possessing no quality that could be called elegant, and every quality that matters at the end of a day that involved 18 pounds of clothing. You climb into bed. You pull the wool blanket up. Now is when you think. The October night around you, the London sounds coming through the attic window, carriage wheels, a voice raised somewhere nearby, the clip of a horse on stone, the low background murmur of a city that does not truly sleep. You listen to it, and you think about the day, about the women in the drawing room, about the young woman in the pink dress and the tension around her eyes, about Frances Sutton and her 8 years of experience and her own hairpins, and you think further back, further in. You think about crinolines. You wore your first full cage crinoline at 13, in Bristol, your aunt's dress, standing in the parlour feeling both architectural and foolish. But women wore them every day throughout the 1860s, and the experience of daily life in a cage crinoline was significantly different from daily life in the bustle you wear now. The cage crinoline was, historically speaking, one of the most remarkable garments ever made. It was introduced in its modern form around 1856, when a patent was taken out for a structure of steel hoops on fabric tape, designed to replace the multiple stiffened petticoats that had been required to achieve the wide-skirted silhouette of the preceding decade. Before the cage crinoline, achieving a full skirt required wearing 6 or more petticoats, some of them starched, some of them weighted, the whole arrangement heavy and hot and structurally unreliable. The cage crinoline replaced all that weight with a framework, a scaffold, that held the skirts outward without requiring the fabric itself to provide the volume. At its height, in the early 1860s, the crinoline could reach a circumference of 12 feet. 12 feet, measured at the widest point of the skirt's hem. The woman inside the crinoline occupied a circle of space roughly 6 feet across. She was, in terms of the room she took up, roughly equivalent to a small piece of furniture. This had consequences for navigation that extended well beyond the bathroom question. Doors. Victorian internal doors were not built for women in 12-foot circumference crinolines, because Victorian internal doors were built for people, and people are not 12 feet in circumference. The technique for getting through a standard door in a full crinoline was specific and had to be learned. Approach the doorway at an angle, compress the crinoline with one hand against your side, ease the compressed structure through the opening, release once clear. Every doorway, all day, a constant minor negotiation between your body's clothing and the architecture it had to pass through. Carriages were worse. Getting into a carriage in a full crinoline required the driver's assistants or the footman's to gather and compress the structure enough to fit it through the carriage door. Once inside, the crinoline had to be arranged so that its hoops didn't spring back and jam against the door frame or press against the windows. Women sat in carriages in the 1860s in very specific configurations, often with the crinoline tilted sideways, leaning against the carriage interior with the structure angled so that it occupied the space without fighting the space. And then there was wind. Wind and a full crinoline was a specific and consistent hazard of outdoor life in the 1860s. The crinoline functioned in anything more than a light breeze, exactly like a sail. It caught the air and the air tried to move it, which meant the air tried to move you. Women caught by sudden gusts in full crinoline could be knocked off balance, spun, or in the worst cases lifted, actually lifted from the ground, like a very uncomfortable kite, before the structure came back down. More commonly, the skirt simply blew upward. The crinoline's cage held the fabric outward, which meant that a strong wind coming from below or at an angle could catch the underside and flip the entire structure. In a single moment, everything the crinoline was designed to conceal became visible to whoever happened to be in the vicinity. There was a term for this, crinoline flight, and newspapers sometimes reported on it in the tone of mild moral alarm that Victorian newspapers adopted when women's legs were involved, which simultaneously pretended this was shocking and confirmed that it happened regularly. But the crinoline's real danger was not the wind. The crinoline's real danger was fire. You were 13 in 1863. You remember the year, not for the crinoline, but for something Mrs. Howard said in the parlour, something about the doctor and fires and women's dresses, something you didn't fully understand at the time, but that your mother's face told you was serious. You understand it now. In 1863, the Lancet, the medical journal that tracked what was actually happening to people's bodies in ways that ordinary newspapers didn't, published numbers. In that year alone, approximately 3,000 women in England had been killed or severely injured by the ignition of their crinolines. 3,000 women in a year. A cage crinoline is a circle of steel hoops, and the skirts draped over those hoops are fabric, cotton, wool, silk, and the cage holds those skirts out, away from the body, at a distance of 2 or 3 feet in every direction. This means the hem of the skirt, the outer edge of that 12-foot circle, is constantly at risk of contact with any heat source in the room. Open fireplaces, gas jets, candles, the coal-burning stoves that heated Victorian kitchens and workrooms. When the hem of a crinoline skirt touched flame, the fire caught fast. The thin fabrics, the multiple layers, the air circulating freely through the cage structure, perfect combustion conditions. And the cage held the fire away from the body, which sounds like it might be protective, but wasn't. It meant the fire could travel upward along the extended surface of the skirt before the wearer even felt the heat. By the time a woman realized the bottom of her skirt was on fire, the fire could already be several feet high. Women burned to death in their own drawing rooms, in kitchens leaning too close to the range, at garden parties standing near a bonfire, in theatres, in ballrooms, wherever open flame and large fabric circles occupied the same space. Your mother knew all of this. She wore a crinoline throughout the 1860s, and she knew, and every time she stood anywhere near anything that was burning, she turned. An automatic gesture so practiced it became unconscious. Rotate the body so the crinoline pointed away from the fire source. Always, without exception. Her spatial awareness of the crinoline and its relationship to heat sources was the spatial awareness of someone who understood what was at stake if she miscalculated. The crinoline went out of fashion in the late 1860s. The silhouette shifted, the skirts narrowed, and then the bustle appeared, and your generation of women moved into a different set of structural challenges and left the crinoline's particular dangers behind. Your bustle does not catch fire as easily. Your bustle fits through standard doors. Your bustle does not sail in a good wind. But your bustle shifts your centre of gravity, requires specific furniture, and still weighs, along with everything over and under it, approximately 18 pounds, and you still have to solve the same daily problem. The night is quiet now. Later. The street outside has dropped to its genuinely late register, the occasional sound, not the steady traffic of evening, the city in its few hours of relative rest. You think about the women who don't have what you have, the water closet, the chamber pot, the house. You've walked through the East End twice in 3 years, once with Mrs. Pemberton on an unusual charitable errand, once on your own on an afternoon off, curiosity taking you further than you'd intended. What you saw there, the housing conditions, the density of people in rooms and streets that weren't designed for that density, has stayed with you in the way that direct evidence of something you've only read about stays with you. The women in the rookeries, the overcrowded neighbourhoods that persist in the East End even in 1875, even after the slum clearances, even after Bazalgette's sewers changed the central districts. Those women don't have water closets. They share privies that serve 6 families or 12 or more. The privies are over cesspits if they're anything at all, and in the summer the smell is... You've read enough to know what the smell is. You've smelled the edge of it on the eastern wind. The women in the textile factories, the match factories, the laundries, the workshops that produce the goods that appear in the shops on Bond Street, those women wear simpler clothing, simpler by necessity. You cannot work near machinery in a crinoline, and the factories knew this, and forbade the wider versions of fashionable dress for exactly the reason that machinery and 18-foot circumference fabric circles do not coexist safely. The women in factories wore shorter skirts, plainer construction, not bustled, sometimes corseted, though less tightly. The working woman's dress was more practical than the fashionable woman's dress by about 40%, but those women worked 12-hour shifts, and the factories had rules about breaks that often didn't account for the frequency of need that human biology produces. And there were women who were docked wages for taking breaks that ran over time, and there were women who drank very little during their shifts for the same reason that you calculate your tea consumption before an event. Not enough water meant headache and fatigue and difficulty, but too much water meant a need that the factory's schedule didn't accommodate. The management of the bodily functions was, for working women, a calculation of poverty rather than etiquette. The stakes were different, not social embarrassment but wage deductions, job loss, the very practical consequence of poverty being made worse. The silence around the problem was the same. The problem was the same. Only the resources for solving it were different. A woman in Lady Whitmore's drawing room had a retiring room, a maid, a water closet with a blue-flowered china bowl, and the social cover of tidying herself as a euphemism that was universally understood and required no further explanation. A woman working a 12-hour shift in a match factory in Bow had a communal privy in the factory yard, docked wages if she used it more than twice in a working day, and no euphemism, because there was no social occasion on which a euphemism would be useful. The difference between them was not about the problem was identical. The difference was about everything else. There is one more thing you think about, lying in the dark with the flannel nightgown and the wool blanket and the sounds of London outside. You think about the Georgian era. You were born in 1850. Your grandmother was born in 1795. And your grandmother's social world had arrangements that make 1875 look in certain respects almost progressive. In the Georgian era, the era of your grandmother's youth, the era of enormous powdered wigs and panniers, and the particular elaborate insanity of late 18th century fashion, the management of women's bodily needs in social settings had an approach that is, depending on your perspective, either completely practical or absolutely shocking, and probably both. At formal dinners in the Georgian period, the women would withdraw from the table at a certain point. This is the origin of the custom that persists in your own era. The ladies withdrawing after dinner while the men drink port, and they would withdraw, in some households, to a room where chamber pots were available. This too was known but not spoken of. The withdrawal for the evening, the phrase that meant something quite specific. But here is the part that makes your own situation feel relatively straightforward by comparison. At some formal dinners, in some households, the chamber pots were not in a separate room. They were in the dining room itself, in the sideboard, behind a curtain, in a cabinet built into the room's furniture, during the meal, while other people were still eating. The men's equivalent, the dining room equipped with a chamber pot behind a screen for use between courses, a convenience so normalised that it barely warranted comment in household management manuals of the period, was considered simply practical. Men did not want to leave the table, leave their port, leave their conversation, so the provision came to them. You think about this sometimes, about the matter-of-factness of it in the 1700s, and then about the extreme reticence of the 1870s, and you wonder what changed. Presumably something changed. Presumably there was a shift, somewhere between your grandmother's generation and your own, where the management of this particular aspect of human biology went from being openly practical to being completely unmentionable. The Victorians invented, among other things, the social silence around what bodies do. Not the body's existence. The Victorians are not prudish about death. Not completely. Not in the way that later eras will be. They have, in this period, a much more direct relationship with mortality than you will see 100 years hence. But the specific silence around digestion, around what the body processes and produces, is a Victorian achievement in the art of selective visibility. What is shown? The silk, the jewellery, the table settings, the architecture, the carriages, the empire. What is not shown? Everything that makes the shown things possible. The hands that clean the house, the labour that produces the food, the infrastructure under the streets, the arrangements made in the retiring room, and the daily engineering of being human in a body and clothing in a society that has decided to pretend that certain things don't happen. They happen. They happen every day. And women manage them, quietly, with the accumulated knowledge of generations, with the open seam in the drawers and the gathered skirts and the retiring room and the orangery and the hedge, and the friend who stands with her back to the relevant direction and doesn't say anything. And then everyone smooths their skirts and goes back to the drawing room and the piano plays. The church bell somewhere toward Gloucester Road strikes 9. Your feet have stopped aching. Your ribs have remembered what a rib cage is at its natural volume. Your waist exists for the next 8 hours at its actual width, unconcerned by what fashion requires of it. You are warm enough, fed enough, safe enough, in a room that is yours, in a city that is enormous and complicated and sometimes difficult and sometimes extraordinary, and you have made it through another Thursday. Tomorrow, Mrs. Pemberton's correspondence, a dressmaker's appointment at 3, the weekly letter to Bristol, which you'll write in the evening, and which will tell your mother about Lady Whitmore's drawing room without mentioning Colonel Beatty, because your mother will make the same calculations as Mrs. Pemberton, and you're not ready for those calculations to converge from both directions. And the Thursday after that, the Cartwrights. Possibly. You think about this for a moment and then you set it aside. The Cartwrights is a problem for next week. Tonight is tonight. The London night continues its operations outside the window. The watermen on the Thames tying up their boats, counting their coin. The women in the East End sharing their privies, managing what they have to manage with the resources they have. The factory girls at home, their shifts done, their feet hurting differently than your feet hurt, from different shoes for different reasons. Lady Whitmore in the first-floor bedroom of the house in Belgrave Square, being helped out of her grey silk by her maid, breathing the first full breath of the day. The young woman in the pink dress, wherever she lives, already in bed probably, the tension gone from around her eyes. All of them, across the city, solving the same daily problem in the same darkness. Some things don't change. The problem doesn't change. The body doesn't change. The need to manage it quietly and continuously and without assistance from an infrastructure that pretends it doesn't exist, that doesn't change. What changes is the resources. What changes is the silence or the lack of it. What changes is who gets the water closet and who gets the shared privy and who gets the orangery. But the knowledge, the practical knowledge, the open seam in the drawers, the gathered skirts, the calculation of tea consumed versus hours until facilities, the signal to the woman in the pink dress that the hallway needs her, that knowledge travels the same way it always has, between women, in the telling, without record. And here you are in 1875 in possession of it, in an attic room in Kensington, warm enough, fed enough, safe enough, the candle gutters. The flame pulls itself thin and then goes. Dark. The darkness is the particular dark of a London night. Not complete, never complete. Always the faint glow of the city on the underside of the clouds, the ambient light of 6 million lives distributed across the dark. A lighter dark than countryside dark. A dark that breathes. You close your eyes. Centuries from now, someone will look at a painting of a Victorian woman. The blue silk, the perfect posture, the gloved hands, the serene expression. The painting will hang in a museum or a gallery or on a wall somewhere, and the person looking at it will see elegance, structure, the beautiful surface of a particular era. They won't see the 18 pounds. They won't see the split seam. They won't see the calculation of tea consumed at 11:30. They won't see the queue on the first floor landing or the network that managed the moment in the drawing room or the woman in Bristol who taught her niece what there is to know about gathered skirts. They won't see any of it. But it was there. All of it was there. Every day. Under every portrait. The portrait is the dress. The woman inside it was managing. The woman inside it always was. Let that settle. Let the dark room around you be quiet. Let the sounds of London diminish to their baseline murmur. The city breathing outside the window, doing its endless work. Let the wool blanket hold the warmth in. Let your feet rest in the open air of the room. Let your ribs do what ribs do when nothing is constraining them. Expand, release, expand again without effort. Let the day go, the correspondence, the soirée, the piano, the young woman in the pink dress, the chrysanthemums and the warm wax in the October garden outside Lady Whitmore's window, Colonel Beatty and his India money, Mrs. Pemberton in the brougham with her eyes closed and her decided expression. Let it all go. You've earned this. Not because you did anything remarkable. You managed a day. You wore the clothes. You solved the problems that the day presented, the ones everyone knows about and the ones nobody mentions, with the competence of someone who's been doing it for years and will do it again tomorrow. That's enough. It's more than enough. It's what most days actually are. The accumulation of managed problems, the quiet engineering of being alive in a body, in an era, in a set of circumstances that require more management than anyone will admit. You managed, now sleep. The church bell somewhere in the direction of the Brompton Road is striking the half hour. Which half hour you're too tired to calculate, and then the calculation stops, and then there's only the dark and the wool and the feet, free of their shoes and the flannel warm against your skin, and the sound of the city diminishing. The sound of Bristol, very faintly, in the weave of the blanket, the sound of your aunt's voice. There are things you need to know. Let me show you. The sound of 1,000 women who knew things that nobody wrote down, teaching each other in the telling, generation to generation. all the practical intelligence of living inside the clothing of their era with dignity and resourcefulness, and the specific kind of competence that comes from having solved a problem so many times it becomes invisible even to the person solving it. You know what they knew. And now, so do you. Let sleep take you. Let it come the way it comes at the end of a long day. Slowly at first, the thoughts still moving, and then faster, the edges softening, and then all at once, the way you step from a lit room into a dark one and the dark closes behind you. Completely. Good night. Morning comes the way it always comes, before you're ready for it. The church bells pull you up from sleep at 6 o'clock, and for that half second between sleeping and waking you've forgotten everything. Not where you are. You know your room, the particular quality of its north-facing darkness, the sound of it, but the day, the weight of it, the clothing and the calculation and the social navigation, and the 18 pounds. For half a second you're just awake, unencumbered, a person in a room in October. Then it comes back. You lie there for a moment longer than you should, looking at the ceiling where the pre-dawn dark is beginning to go grey. Through the attic window, nothing yet, just the particular non-light of London before sunrise, the city's ambient glow sitting on the underside of the clouds. Your feet have recovered. Your waist is itself. Your hair is spread across the pillow in the way it never is during the day, loose and actually its own shape, not the constructed shape that hairpins and a dressing hour impose on it. You get up, chamber pot first, in the cold dark, before you're properly awake. This is the honest start of the day, the entirely private, entirely practical first act of being alive in a body in the morning. Quick, necessary, done. Then the washstand. Cold water on your face, your hands, your neck. The particular shock of it that functions as the border between sleeping and waking, more reliable than the church bells. Then you look at the chair. The clothes are there. Mary has laid them out. The corset, the chemise, the petticoats, the bustle. And over the door, not the peacock blue today, which is back in Mrs. Pemberton's wardrobe where it belongs, but your working dress, the dark green wool that is to the peacock silk roughly what a reliable cart horse is to a racehorse. Less glamorous, significantly more practical for the actual work of the day. The corset goes on first. The routine closes around you like the corset itself. The sequence of it, the particular order of each layer, the morning arrival of Mary at 7 with her County Clare hands and her efficient silence. You breathe out before the final pull. You know what you're doing. You've done it so many times that the knowledge lives in your hands, in your body, in the automatic movements of dressing that require no conscious direction. 18 pounds, assembled. Another Thursday ended, another Friday begun. 3 weeks pass. October moves through its grey middle portion and begins to harden toward November. The days shortening perceptibly, the afternoon light gone by 4, the coal fires going up earlier in every room. The smell of London in late October is specific and slightly melancholy. Coal smoke and wet stone and the last of the fallen leaves going dark on the pavements, and underneath it all the Thames, which you cannot see from Onslow Gardens but can always, faintly, smell. The river smell of salt and mud and distance, and the particular history of a waterway that has been the centre of something enormous for long enough that the smell has absorbed all of it. The Cartwright soirée happens on the second Thursday of November. Colonel Beatty is there. Mrs. Pemberton is strategically satisfied. You talk to the Colonel about the irrigation systems of the Punjab, which he knows about from practical experience, and about which you know enough to ask good questions, and the conversation lasts 40 minutes and is genuinely interesting. He asks if he may call. You tell him you will let Mrs. Pemberton know. Mrs. Pemberton is told. Mrs. Pemberton is satisfied in a way she expresses as mild indifference, and that you've learned to read as quiet triumph. On the 15th of November, Colonel Beatty calls at Onslow Gardens. You sit in the drawing room with Mrs. Pemberton present, and you talk about India and the administrative challenge of governing a subcontinent from an island, and he is not stupid, and you're not going to pretend to be stupid, and by the time he leaves 2 hours later, something has been established between you that is not quite friendship and not quite courtship, but is somewhere in the territory between them, which is, for 1875, the appropriate starting point. Mrs. Pemberton walks him to the door herself, which she almost never does. When she comes back, she doesn't say anything for approximately 3 minutes, which is a very long time for Mrs. Pemberton. Then, he's decent enough. He is. Not stupid. No. His pension from the Indian Civil Service is adequate. Is it? I asked Gerald's solicitor to look into it. She straightens the arrangement of books on the side table, in a way that suggests she's rearranging something else entirely. You might do worse. Mrs. Pemberton? I'm not saying anything. She's saying several things. You let her say them without responding to any of them directly, which is one of the skills you've developed in 3 years. I'm not in a hurry, you say. At 25, she says, a woman is not as unhurried as she thinks. This is true, technically. It is also one of the more honest things Mrs. Pemberton has said to you in 3 years of employment, and you're not entirely sure what to do with the honesty. I'll think about it, you say. She nods. She goes back to her book. November brings the night soil men. They've been coming all along, of course. This is not something that started in November. This is something that has been happening since before you arrived in London, since before anyone currently alive in London was born, since the city first grew large enough to produce more waste than its immediate surroundings could absorb. But November makes them more noticeable, or you make them more noticeable, because the November mornings are cold enough that when the smell of them comes through the window, you've cracked slightly open for air. The contrast between the cold, clean outside air and the smell of the carts is sharper. They come before dawn. This is the arrangement, the ancient rule of the night soil trade. Before the respectable population is up, before the morning commences, before the city turns its face to the day, the men who deal with what the city produces come with their carts and their tools and their particular expertise, and they take it away. Mrs. Pemberton's water closet connects to the sewer. The sewers are Bazalgette's great achievement, the intercepting system that replaced the old direct relationship between London's privies and London's river, and they are genuinely, measurably miraculous in what they've done for the city's health. Before the sewers, London's cholera epidemics came in waves. 1832, 1849, 1853, 1866, each one killing tens of thousands of people, the poorest ones first, the ones whose water supply and whose waste disposal were the same system. After the sewers, the main ones, the ones that serve the central districts, the death tolls dropped. But the sewers don't reach everywhere. In the outer districts, in the parts of the East End that are still waiting for the infrastructure to catch up, in the courts and alleys of Southwark that predated Bazalgette's plans and have not yet been included in the revisions, in the areas where new building hasn't yet brought new drainage, the night soil men still operate. They go into the privies with their long-handled tools and their sealed carts. They take what's accumulated, they bring it to the collection points, from which it goes by barge down the Thames and eventually, theoretically eventually, to the agricultural fields that in the official version of the system use it as fertiliser. In practice, the system is imperfect. The Thames still smells, particularly in summer. The connection between waste disposal and waterborne disease, which John Snow demonstrated in 1854 by mapping the Soho cholera outbreak to a single pump handle and removing it, that connection is understood now, officially understood, the germ theory slowly winning its argument against the older miasma theory. But understanding it and implementing the infrastructure to act on it are not the same speed. You know about John Snow because you read about him in a medical journal that came to the house when Gerald Pemberton was alive and which nobody thought to cancel, and which you've been reading in the years since, quietly, in the evenings. Dr. Snow, the Broad Street pump, 57 deaths in 3 days from a single contaminated water source, and Snow going door to door, mapping the cases, identifying the cluster, understanding that cholera travelled not through bad air but through contaminated water, and then going to the local authorities and asking them to remove the pump handle, which they did, which ended the outbreak. The pump handle. Such a small thing. The difference between a pump handle in place and a pump handle removed, and 57 people who didn't die. You think about this sometimes when you wash your hands. The simple act of washing your hands, which doctors were barely beginning to understand, was necessary in the 1870s, which Semmelweis demonstrated, and which the medical establishment resisted for years with the vigour of people whose dignity was at stake. The simple act of washing your hands between the water closet and the breakfast table. The water closet connected to the sewer emptying where Bazalgette designed it to empty, far enough from London's water intakes to make the connection between in and out less immediately lethal. The cold water at the basin in your room. You wash your hands every morning. It takes 30 seconds. It has, in the larger history of your life, probably done more for your health than everything else combined. On a cold Saturday in mid-November, Mrs. Pemberton sends you on an errand to a draper's shop in Kensington High Street to collect a parcel of trimming she's ordered for a new day dress. You're glad for it. The house has been confining lately, the correspondence tedious, and your feet have the itchy energy of someone who needs to walk. You walk because you like walking, not because it's more economical than a cab, though it is. The November streets of Kensington in the morning have a particular quality. The shops just opened, the traffic not yet at full volume, the cold air clean enough by South Kensington standards that you can take a full breath of it and feel the chill of it all the way to your ribs. You pass a print shop window and you stop for a moment, the way you always stop at print shop windows, because print shops in 1875 are one of the places where the city's visual record is most concentrated. Illustrations, fashion plates, maps, satirical cartoons, reproductions of paintings. The window of this one has a row of coloured fashion plates showing the current season's silhouette, and next to them a series of historical plates, fashioned through the decades, arranged in chronological sequence. The 1830s, romantic era wide sleeves and narrowed waist. The 1840s, the first real version of the corseted silhouette, skirts beginning to spread. The 1850s, the full skirt achieved through multiple petticoats just before the cage crinoline. The 1860s, the cage crinoline at its extreme, the skirt at its widest, the silhouette its most architecturally dramatic. You look at the 1860s plate for a long time. You remember seeing women in full crinoline on the streets of Bristol when you were 12, 13. the actual physical experience of a city full of these structures, the way pedestrian traffic had to adapt, the way two women in full crinolines meeting on a narrow pavement required a negotiation, one of them pressing against the wall while the other passed, because there was simply not room for 24 feet of combined circumference on a standard Bristol pavement. You remember thinking it was beautiful and impractical, and somehow both at once in a way that seemed to characterize a lot of things about being a woman. The woman in the print shop window wears her crinoline with perfect fashion plate composure. She is not standing near a fireplace. She's not navigating a door. She's not in a wind. She's in the space of the illustration, which has no architecture and no weather and no fire sources, and in that space the silhouette is genuinely extraordinary. The waist drawn in, the skirt sweeping outward in a full perfect circle, the whole construction suggesting, what? Abundance, probably. Wealth. The visual language of the era expressing prosperity through volume. But you also know what the woman in the illustration would have to do, every day, in every doorway, in every carriage, in every room with a fireplace, to maintain that silhouette in contact with the actual world. The constant minor engineering, the spatial awareness baked into every movement, the practice of rotating away from heat sources that became so automatic your mother still does it, even now, even in her practical 1870s dress, still turns her body away from open fireplaces in a gesture that her crinoline-wearing years inscribed in her. You turn away from the print shop window and keep walking. The draper shop is warm and smells of fabric. The dusty wool smell of bolts of cloth stacked floor to ceiling, with underneath it the sharper smell of the dyes and the specific industrial smell of new fabric fresh from the mill. That's different from the settled smell of fabric that's been made into something and worn and washed many times. You love this smell. You've always loved it. It's one of the things that makes the errands to drapery shops genuinely pleasant, rather than just professionally necessary. A girl comes to help you, 16 maybe, sharp-eyed in the way of someone who is learning a trade and taking it seriously. You give her Mrs. Pemberton's name. She goes to the back to find the parcel. While you wait, a woman comes through the door from the street, about 40, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone who's been well-dressed for long enough that it's stopped being something she thinks about. She's wearing a carriage dress in heavy dark wool, and her coat is good quality, and she has the small signs of prosperity that you've learned to read in 3 years of working for Mrs. Pemberton. The gloves that fit exactly right, the shoes that show recent professional attention. She stops near you, waiting for an assistant of her own, and the two of you stand in the particular shared waiting silence of a shop, which is one of the few social spaces where strangers of similar apparent class can occupy the same space in comfortable quiet. Then she catches you looking at the fashion plates displayed near the window, the current season silhouettes, with a row of historical comparisons below. "Do you remember the crinoline?" she says. Not an intrusion. The question has the tone of someone observing a shared memory, a fellow survivor. "I wore one briefly, as a girl, you say. My aunt's." "I wore them for 8 years," she says. 1861 to 1869. She looks at the illustrations with an expression that contains several things simultaneously. Nostalgia, something like relief, a kind of retrospective irony. They were extraordinary to look at, absolutely impractical to live in. "My mother still turns away from fireplaces," you say. She looks at you. "Mine too," she says. She can't help it. She pauses. "I knew a woman who burned, a friend of my sister's, 22 years old, 1864. She leaned across the table to reach something at a dinner party, just reached across without thinking, and the hem of her dress touched the candelabra, and it caught. She says it quietly, not dramatically, the way you say things you've had a long time to settle with. Did she, you begin, she survived, most of her. The left side of her, she pauses. She survived. She didn't attend many dinner parties after that. You're quiet. They say 3,000 women in 1 year, she says. In England alone, 3,000. And the newspapers wrote about it, and the doctors wrote about it, and there were letters in the Times about it, and fashion continued exactly as it had. Until it didn't. Until the fashion changed for other reasons, not because of the fires. She looks at the illustration, the 1860s crinoline, the perfect circle of fabric. The fashion changed because the silhouette changed, because the designers decided the silhouette should change, not because 3,000 women burned. The assistant returns with her parcel. She takes it, nods at you with the brief acknowledgement of a shared observation, and goes back out into the November street. You stand there for another moment in the warm draper's shop. 3,000 women in a year, while the fashion continued. The girl comes back with Mrs. Pemberton's parcel, and you pay for it, and you pick it up and you go out into the cold. The parcel is not heavy, but it is bulky, and carrying it through the streets of Kensington in your working dress and your sensible shoes, sensible by your standards, which means only moderately narrow, moderately heeled, you think about what the woman said. 3,000 women in a year. And the fashion didn't change. Fashion never changes for the reasons you might think it should. Fashion changes when the aesthetics change, when the people who decide what is beautiful decide to decide something different is beautiful. The structural danger of the crinoline was known, was documented, was measured in the Lancet, and the crinoline continued until the silhouette shifted, for purely visual reasons, toward the narrower skirts of the late 1860s. The dangers that were documented and changed nothing, and the solutions that were never documented and changed everything. The split seam in the drawers, known by every woman who wore the clothing, never written down, never in the fashion press, never in the etiquette manuals, the gathered skirts, the assembled expertise of managing what the clothing required of you. All of it existing entirely in the oral tradition, the women-to-women transfer of knowledge that leaves no archive because nobody was looking for it, and nobody thought to preserve it. What gets written down? The design of the clothing, the names of the dressmakers, the names of the women who wore the dresses, where they wore them, who they spoke to. What doesn't get written down? What they did at the end of the first floor landing, second door on the right. You carry the parcel home through the November streets. December arrives and brings with it the cold that even the coal fires in every room of Mrs. Pemberton's house can only partially address. Your attic room is the furthest from the central heating of the house. Heat rises, but not as far as the third floor of a Victorian terraced house. Not reliably, not in December. The fire in your room is small, because the chimney in the attic is small, because the attic was built for servants, and the chimney reflects what the builders thought servants deserved from a fire. You sleep in the flannel nightgown and 2 blankets. You wash in cold water faster than in summer. The chemise you put on first is cold until your body warms it. The corset in December morning is a steel-boned circle of cold fabric that you place around yourself and which takes several minutes to warm to your temperature. This is winter. The practical winter of 1875. inside a well-maintained terraced house in South Kensington, which is on the better end of what London winter offers. There are people sleeping in this city tonight, in December in 1875, for whom the cold is not the minor inconvenience of a slightly underpowered attic fire, but the actual dangerous cold of a room without heat, of clothing without sufficient warmth, of a body that is burning its available fuel simply to maintain its core temperature. The match girls in the factories at Bow, making the phosphorus-tipped matches that light the coal fires that warm houses like Mrs. Pemberton's. The women working the laundries, standing at stone sinks in December, their hands in cold water or hot water depending on the stage of the process, both equally damaging in their different ways. The cold water cracking the skin at the knuckles, the hot water scalding, the repeated wetting and drying and wetting producing the kind of chapped, cracked, perpetually damaged hands that you notice when you compare your own hands, maintained carefully by gloves and moderate work, to the hands of working women you see in the streets. The women in the rookeries of Whitechapel and Bermondsey, where the shared privy is at the end of the court and getting to it at 3 a.m. in December, means going into the cold in whatever you have to wrap around yourself. A shawl, probably, not a coat because coats are expensive, and navigating the dark court to a structure that serves 20 families and has been emptied last whenever someone managed to arrange and pay for the emptying. Your chamber pot under your bed in the warmth of your room, filled and emptied daily by Mary who is paid to fill and empty it. This is your December 3 a.m. solution, and it is, compared to the alternatives available to much of London's female population, a luxury. You understand this. You understood it when you arrived in London and saw the East End once, and you understand it more completely now, 3 years in, having had time to read and to observe, and to place the specifics of your own daily management problems within the larger context of what managing means across the full range of London's social spectrum. It means something different at every level, but it is always happening. The management is always happening, from the woman in the attic room on Onslow Gardens to the woman in the court in Whitechapel, though the resources are entirely different. The clothing is different. The consequences of failing to manage are different. The problem is the same. The human body in December in 1875 is exactly what it's always been. Colonel Beatty calls 3 more times before Christmas. On his second visit, Mrs. Pemberton develops a pressing need to consult with Mary about the household accounts and removes herself from the drawing room for 45 minutes, which is transparent and also, you realise, quite kind. She's giving you the space she has decided you need, in the way she has decided you need it, which is the Mrs. Pemberton version of generosity. Organised, slightly controlling, but genuinely motivated by your welfare as she understands it. The 45 minutes with Colonel Beatty alone. Well, not alone. There are proprieties. Mary is somewhere nearby and the drawing-room door is partially open, is better than you expected it to be. He is funny, in a dry way, about India and the particular comedy of colonial administration. He asks about Bristol with real curiosity and listens to the answers. He has read a respectable amount, not everything, but enough to talk about, and he doesn't condescend about what he hasn't read. He also, at one point, asks you a direct question about something administrative. A real question, not a social question, the kind that expects a real answer. And you give him one, and he listens to the answer, and he says, "I hadn't thought of it that way," without any of the adjustment that men sometimes make when they encounter an opinion from a woman that they hadn't already formed themselves. You think about this later, washing your face at the cold basin before bed. He hadn't thought of it that way. 3 years of "that's very interesting" and "how clever of you," and the particular social dance of managing the expression of intelligence in rooms where intelligence in a woman requires constant calibration. And here is a man who said, "I hadn't thought of it that way," in the tone of someone who's now thinking about it that way. It's not nothing. Christmas comes. Mrs. Pemberton goes to her sister's family in Surrey for 2 weeks and takes Mary but not you, which is a negotiated arrangement that gives you 2 weeks of the house and your own time and a much reduced salary for the period. You go to Bristol. The train from Paddington, 2¼ hours, the Great Western Railway, performing its entirely miraculous compression of distance that still surprises you slightly, even 3 years in, even knowing exactly how it works. 2 hours and a quarter and you're in Bristol, and your sister is at the station, and the air smells like Bristol, different from London, cleaner in some directions and different dirty in others. The smell of the River Avon, and the shipyards, and the tobacco trade, and the particular winter smell of a provincial English city that is prosperous without being metropolitan. Your mother's house. Your father, older now, thinner, with a careful quality to his movements that speaks of a body that started requiring management. Your sister, 2 years younger than you, already engaged to a man who sells insurance in Clifton, and who your mother considers a very good match, and who you consider adequate. Your brother, who's away at his articles in Manchester, and sends letters that smell of industrial coal and young male ambition. The house is smaller than you remembered. It always is. London expands the sense of scale, and Bristol returns you to what normal actually looks like outside London, which is narrower and more human and sometimes more honest. Your mother asks about London, about Mrs. Pemberton, and whether she's difficult, about Colonel Beatty because Mrs. Pemberton wrote to her. They correspond, Mrs. Pemberton and your mother, which you never quite knew, and apparently describe the situation in terms that your mother has been filing under a particular category of maternal priority. Is he kind? Your mother asks on the second evening, when your father has gone to bed and your sister is reading, and you and your mother sitting with the fire and the tea in the comfortable silence of people who've known each other long enough that silence doesn't need filling. I think so, genuinely. Not performing kindness? No, or not just performing it. Your mother is quiet for a moment. She turns her cup in her hands the way she does when she's thinking about something, with more care than casual conversation requires. "Are you happy?" she asks. This is not the question you expected. You sit with it for a moment. In London, generally. Yes, I think so. I'm good at the work. Mrs. Pemberton and I understand each other well enough. That's not what I asked. You look at the fire. I'm content, you say. Most of the time I'm content. Sometimes I want... You pause. I want more room. More than £40 a year and a borrowed dress. And a room on the 3rd floor. I don't mean that as a complaint. I mean that I'm aware of the edges of the space I occupy. Your mother nods. Your aunt was like that, she says, before she married Joseph. That feeling of the edges. And after? Different edges. She smiles slightly. But more room inside them eventually. The fire shifts in the grate. Your mother does the thing she always does near fires. She turns her body slightly, automatically, so the skirts aren't angled toward the heat. It's been 6 years since she wore a crinoline, and the gesture remains. You notice it. You don't say anything. You sit with your mother in the Bristol evening, and the familiar smell of the house, wool and beeswax, and the particular smell of this specific fireplace, which is different from every other fireplace you've ever sat near because it's this one, the one you grew up with, and you feel the particular sensation that visits comes home produce, the strange double vision of yourself as you are now, superimposed on the self you were when this house was the only house, when Bristol was the whole world, when London was a word for something that other people did. Both of those selves are you. Both are true. And in the space between them is 3 years of managed mornings and borrowed dresses and drawing room calculations and a man who says I hadn't thought of it that way and means it. Not nothing at all. January in London. You're back before Mrs. Pemberton is back, which is what you arranged, because Mrs. Pemberton's return requires the house to be in order, and the house in order requires someone to have insured it. Mary sees to the practical elements. You see to the correspondence that accumulated over the 2 weeks, which is considerable, and to the social calendar that needs updating, and to the half-dozen organisational matters that Mrs. Pemberton's life produces continuously, whether she's in Surrey or not. January is cold. January in London smells of coal smoke more than any other month, because every house and every factory and every office is burning coal in its attempt to stay warmer than the January air outside, and the combined output of all that burning sits in the London air with a density that makes the city's winter visible as well as smellable. A particular yellow-grey quality to the light on bad days, a taste at the back of the throat on good ones. On the very cold days the mornings are remarkable. The cold intensifies every smell. The frost on the Onslow Gardens pavement, the coal smoke, the horses on the street, the bread from the baker 2 doors down. Cold air is a kind of lens that makes the olfactory landscape sharper, more specific, each element more distinct from the others. You walk when you can. The cold doesn't bother you in the way that it bothers Mrs. Pemberton, who moves between heated rooms in the carriage and considers outdoor January air something to cross through rather than something to experience. You grew up walking in Bristol weather, which is wetter than London if not always colder, and the physiology of walking in cold air, the particular warmth that movement generates inside all the layers, the cold on your face, which is the only exposed part of you, the way your feet generate their own heat inside the shoes, is familiar and actually pleasant. Though the shoes in January require the thick winter stockings, and the thick winter stockings require the drawers to be worn over them rather than under, which is, well, an adjustment in the standard assembly. You'd mentioned this once vaguely to Frances Sutton at a January event, and she'd nodded with the specificity of someone who'd worked out the same solution independently and arrived at the same conclusion. The daily adjustments, seasonal, circumstantial. The small individual modifications to the standard procedure that you work out through practice and share with the women who are working out the same things. Not written down, not necessary to write down, because the people who need to know will learn. February. Frances Sutton and you have, over the intervening months, developed the kind of friendship that companions develop, built on shared professional understanding, conducted primarily in the edges of social events, characterized by the particular efficiency of conversation between 2 people who don't have much time and have learned to make their exchanges useful. You meet at a musical evening in February, the kind where the music is secondary to the conversation, but provides its cover, and you find a position together near the back of the room and you do the thing you always do. Brief operational survey, locate the necessary rooms, assess the social topology. How is Mrs. Holland's hip, you ask? Worse in the cold. Better last week when we had that mild spell. She's determined to go to everything regardless. I think events are the structure her days depend on. Mrs. Pemberton is the same. The social calendar is the architecture of her week. What would they do, Francis says, without us to make the calendar work? It's a genuine question as much as it's a rhetorical one. You think about it. What would we do, you say, without the calendar to organise it? She considers this. I've been with Mrs. Holland for 8 years. I'm 33. I think about what's next sometimes. Is there someone? There was. He went to Australia in 1870 and wrote for a year and then stopped. She says it with the finality of someone who has located the fact of it and stored it where it doesn't affect her daily functioning. I'm not melancholy about it anymore. I've just been thinking about what 8 years becomes in another 8 years. I've been thinking about Colonel Beatty, you say. She looks at you. He's not stupid, you say. That's a start. He listens. Better start. He asked me a genuine question about Indian administration and didn't apologise for the fact that I had an answer. Francis Sutton nods slowly. That's the one to marry. The one who doesn't require you to perform incompetence so he can feel competent. The music shifts to something slower. Around you, the room continues its social operations. Mrs. Holland would be lost without you, you say. She would, Francis agrees without vanity. She'd hire someone else and be lost for about 6 months and then she'd be fine. She pauses. People are always finer than the people who manage them believe. You think about Mrs. Pemberton, about whether she'd be fine without you, about the particular nature of being necessary to someone in a way that is both real. She genuinely does rely on you, genuinely does function better with you, and also contingent, also replaceable, also not quite the same as being valued for yourself. The distinction between useful and valued. You've been useful for 3 years. You're not certain about valued. Maybe that's what's next. Spring comes, and with it the particular lightning that London spring produces. Not dramatic, not the sudden warmth of more southerly places, but a gradual shift. The days longer first, then brighter, then finally warmer, the coal fires going out earlier in April than in January. The smell of London changes. The coal smoke thins slightly. The morning frost stops, and something else comes in underneath. The Thames in its spring register, different from autumn, and the faint green smell of the parks, which is not a smell you notice consciously, but which you notice by its absence when you spend a day entirely indoors. In spring, the amount of clothing adjusts. The flannel petticoat comes off. The wool dress is exchanged for the lighter wool, which is exchanged by May for cotton. The corset doesn't change. The corset is the corset in every season, but the layers above and below it thin, and the weight of the ensemble drops from 18 pounds toward 14, and the sensation of that difference is surprising. Every year, how much lighter 14 pounds feels than 18. You think about this sometimes, about how quickly you adapt to weight and then readapt to its absence, about the way the body naturalizes what it lives with, metabolizes it into baseline, so that the thing which was once unusual becomes the condition you measure other things against. 18 pounds of clothing feels, after enough years, like what dressed is supposed to feel like. It feels normal. When you take it off at night, the lightness, the actual lightness of a body unencumbered, is what surprises you. The corset feels, after enough years, like your own structure. Your actual rib cage feels unfamiliar when you first release it in the evenings. what you normalise. Anything, given enough time. The human body's capacity to adjust to what it's given and treat the given as the baseline is extraordinary and occasionally troubling. 3,000 women a year burned. And the fashion continued, because the fashion was the baseline. The women burning were the deviation. You take your walks in May in lighter clothing, with a lighter step, and the London spring around you is doing its best impression of something approaching pleasant. In April, Colonel Beatty asks Mrs. Pemberton if he may speak with you privately. Mrs. Pemberton, who has been anticipating this request since approximately November, says yes with a studied casualness that fools nobody. The conversation takes place in the drawing room on a Tuesday afternoon in April, with the curtains not quite fully open and the spring light coming through, in the way spring light comes through windows, at a lower angle than summer, softer, the quality of it specific to the season. He asks in the way that men ask in 1875, which is formal and slightly awkward and genuine underneath the formality. He mentions his prospects, which are real. He mentions his feelings, which are, as far as you can tell, also real. He mentions that he is aware you have a mind and that he intends to keep being aware of it. That last part specifically, you say yes. Not immediately. There is a necessary pause, a performance of considered deliberation that the situation requires. But yes. He looks, when you say yes, like a man who had prepared himself for a more complicated negotiation, and finds the straightforwardness both a relief and slightly disorienting. You're very direct, he says. I've been a companion for 3 years, you say. I've spent 3 years being diplomatically indirect. I'm finding I prefer direct. He laughs. He has a good laugh. The same laugh you first noticed at Lady Whitmore's, when he said something about India that made everyone in earshot briefly forget their social postures and simply respond. You get up and you go to the door to call Mrs. Pemberton, who is sitting in the hallway on the chair nearest the drawing-room door with a book she's definitely not reading, and who comes in with an expression of carefully manufactured surprise, and who shakes Colonel Beatty's hand with the satisfaction of someone whose organising intelligence has produced the expected result. Gerald would have liked him, she says later, when the Colonel has gone and you are sitting in the drawing-room in the April evening with the curtains open to the last of the light. You think so? Gerald had good taste in people. She pauses. Terrible taste in port. Excellent taste in people. You look out the window at Onslow Gardens. The lime trees are leafing, just beginning, the earliest green of them, translucent against the evening sky. I'll need a replacement, Mrs. Pemberton says, when it's settled. I know. I'll want to find someone before, not be left without. I'm not good at being left without. I know that too. She's quiet for a moment. Agnes. She uses your name, not Miss Hartwell, not often. You've been very good, very capable. I'm not always... She stops. For Mrs. Pemberton, who rarely leaves sentences incomplete, this is significant. You've been good to me too, you say. She nods. She looks at the window. Yes, she says. I have, rather. The April evening settles around you. The drawing room with its familiar arrangement, its familiar smell. The writing table where you've written 4,000 letters. The chair that accommodates the bustle. The chair that doesn't. The arrangement of it all, the texture of 3 years, sitting quietly in the room with the woman who organised your London. You'll miss it when you're gone. Not everything. Not the £40 and the borrowed dresses and the narrowness of the space. But this, the particular understanding between two people who've managed to share a life without entirely sharing a life, who have worked out the choreography of coexistence, who have, despite the hierarchy and the daily friction, and the 45 minutes Mrs. Pemberton spent pretending to consult Mary about the accounts, manage something that looks, from this angle, like a kind of affection. Summer arrives before the wedding does. This is by design. Summer in London is better than winter for the practical logistics of weddings, which require a reasonable number of people to be in the same place at the same time, in good enough weather to make the journey to the church without arriving damp. In July you make your choices, not just about the wedding, though there are many choices there: the dress, the arrangements, the guest list, the church, the breakfast afterward, all the organising intelligence that 3 years of companion work has honed, and that you bring to bear on your own occasion with the same methodical competence you've brought to Mrs. Pemberton's social life. The practical choices too, specifically the undergarments. You're having the dress made from the beginning for once, not altered from someone else's, and the dressmaker is a woman of 50 who's been making wedding dresses in Kensington for 20 years, and who sits across from you in her workroom in June and asks, with the directness of someone whose entire professional life is the intersection of women's bodies and the clothes that cover them, what do you need it to do? What does a wedding dress in 1875 need to do? It needs to accommodate a corset, obviously. It needs to accommodate the bustle that is still, in 1875, the required structural element of the fashionable silhouette. It needs a reasonable train, not a court train, not the enormous theatrical length that royal occasions require, but enough to make the walk down the aisle something that moves in the intended way. And it needs to be wearable for a day that will be longer than most. A wedding in 1875 begins in the morning and extends through the afternoon and into the evening, and the woman wearing the dress will need to manage all the things that any woman manages in a long dress over a long day, including the things that nobody discusses in the wedding preparations. The dressmaker, who has been making wedding dresses for 20 years, understands all of this without being told. The fitted waist, she says, making notes. I can build it to lace from the side as well as the back. Gives you a little more flexibility through the day. That would be very practical. And the skirt, if we put the inner layer on a separate waistband rather than attached to the bodice, she gestures. Easier to manage the construction when you need to. She says when you need to with the specific tact of professional experience, and you understand her exactly, and you nod. The dress is made. The waistband is designed as she suggested. The inner layer accommodates the practical requirements, without drawing any attention to them in the finished exterior. The exterior is ivory silk, not pure white, which is actually a relatively recent convention, and one that you don't feel the need to perform. With the bustle in the fashionable low position that the season requires, and a modest train that the dressmaker has seamed and finished so that it flows correctly and releases cleanly from behind. It is a beautiful dress. You stand in the dressmaker's studio in your final fitting, and you look at yourself in the large mirror. Really look. The full-length version of yourself that you rarely see in the small mirror in your attic room, and you think, this is what 18 pounds of clothing can produce, at its best, for the particular occasion it's designed for. The construction is extraordinary. The workmanship, the way the whole assembled structure presents itself as something other than what it is, which is engineering. Complicated engineering in the service of aesthetics, and inside the structure, you, in your split-crotch drawers and your corset and your flannel petticoat, the same daily infrastructure that every day of the last 12 years has been built on. The same. Exactly the same as always. The dress is new. The woman in the dress is the woman who's been getting dressed every morning for 25 years, starting with the plain cotton chemise and ending with whatever the outer layer of the day requires, solving the same daily problems in the same daily ways, with the same knowledge that was taught to her and that she will teach, eventually, to whoever needs to know. The wedding is in July, on a Thursday, which feels right. St Mary's, Kensington, which is walking distance from Onslow Gardens, and which has the kind of high windows that make summer light look like something intentional. Mrs. Pemberton sits in the front pew on your side, which is a negotiated position. She has no formal claim to it, but she has made a significant informal claim over 3 years, and you gave it to her because it's true, and because the formality of the occasion suddenly clarifies what the informal structure of 3 years has actually been. Your mother is also in the front pew on the other side of Mrs. Pemberton, and the two of them, who have been corresponding for 3 years about you, apparently, the correspondence of women who care about the same person for different reasons, and who have reached, through letters, a kind of understanding, sits side by side with the composed expressions of women who have organised this outcome from different directions and are allowing themselves to be satisfied. Frances Sutton is there, in the third pew. She catches your eye when you come in, and she raises one eyebrow by the standard millimetre, and you give her the standard minimal nod. The service, the vows, the mechanics of the occasion, which work as they're supposed to work. And afterward, in the vestry, before the photographs, there are photographs because it's 1875 and photography is real and available, and your mother has insisted. Frances Sutton finds you for a moment in the small crowd of well-wishers, and she presses your hands in both of hers. "Well done," she says. "It's not an achievement. Everything is an achievement," she says. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She looks at you for a moment. He's not stupid. He listens. He doesn't require you to perform incompetence. No. Then it will probably be fine. She releases your hands. More than fine. She goes to find Mrs. Holland, who is overdressed and slightly tearful, in the way that people become at weddings when they are watching something happen that reminds them of something that didn't. The summer house that will be your first home together is in Bayswater. Not grand. A rented first floor of a terraced house sensibly proportioned, with a water closet on the landing between the floors that the landlady mentions twice in the inventory, as if expecting it to be disputed. You do not dispute it. You install yourself in the Bayswater rooms in August, and you stand in what is now your drawing room, with the August light coming in the south-facing windows, and you think, this is it then. This is the next space. Different edges, your mother said. More room inside them. You look at the room. It's smaller than Mrs. Pemberton's drawing room. The furniture is plainer. The ceiling is lower, but it's yours. The ceiling is yours. The furniture arrangement is yours to decide. The correspondence on the writing table, when there is correspondence, will be addressed in your own name, your new name, not in Mrs. Pemberton's name on Mrs. Pemberton's behalf. That's not nothing. You're standing in the Bayswater drawing room in August 1876, approximately 1 year after the Thursday, when you sat in the brougham outside Lady Whitmore's house on Belgrave Square, and did the arithmetic about the number of guests and the probable length of the queue at the one retiring room on the first floor landing, and your life has changed considerably. But you're still putting on the corset in the morning, the flannel petticoat in winter, the cotton in summer. The bustle, the second bustle period is coming. You can see the silhouette beginning to shift in the fashion plates toward the more dramatic posterior projection of the version that will dominate the 1880s. But for now, it's still the first period, still the softer version you've been wearing for 4 years. You are still split at the seam. The drawers are still open at the crotch, and you're still managing the gathering of skirts with both hands, and you're still making the calculation about tea consumed versus hours until facilities when you go out to social events, and you're still asking the discreet question of the nearest maid upon arrival at any new venue. Some things are different. Some things are not. The body doesn't change. The body is still the body, in July and August and October and December, in a terraced house in Bayswater, or an attic room in South Kensington, or a Bristol parlour in Christmas week. The daily requirements don't change. The management of them requires the same knowledge it always has, the knowledge that your aunt gave you, that the makers of the drawers encoded in the design, that you'll give someday to whoever needs it, the knowledge that lives in the telling, that leaves no archive. That exists entirely in the continuity of women teaching each other what there is to know about living inside the architecture of their era. It is evening. The August light is gone. The Bayswater drawing room is in the particular post-dinner quiet of a small house at the end of a long summer day. The warmth still in the air, the windows open to the garden smell of August London, which is grass and coal smoke and the distant Thames. You're in the armchair with a book. The husband who doesn't require you to perform incompetence is at the writing table with a letter. The sound of the pen on paper periodic and comfortable. The sound of another person in the room. The corset is still on. You'll deal with it upstairs later with the newly negotiated assistance that married life has produced. And the bustle is still in its correct position, and your feet are in their shoes. The day is not quite done yet, but the book is good. The August evening is warm. The sounds of Bayswater outside the window are the sounds of a city going about its business, which is a sound you've been listening to for 4 years, and which you've come to need in the way you've come to need tea in the morning. Not dramatically, not desperately, but steadily, as part of the texture of days. You read. Years will pass. The bustle era will have its second version, more dramatic, more extreme. The posterior projection of the mid-1880s making the 1870s version look almost restrained by comparison. Then the silhouette will shift again. It always shifts. It always finds something new to do with the female form that involves some new architecture and some new set of daily management problems. Toward the narrower skirts of the 1890s and eventually the Edwardian simplification that will seem, to women who wore the bustle, almost shockingly practical. The drawers will change. Slowly. By the end of the century, some women are wearing closed-crotch drawers, a different construction, reflecting changed skirt volumes, changed management strategies. By the early 20th century, as skirts narrow and shorten, the split seam will become less universal, though not absent. The management strategy will evolve along with the clothing, because it always has, because the management strategy is inseparable from the clothing. The solution is inside the problem, encoded in the design. The water closets will spread, the sewers will reach more neighbourhoods, the night soil men will become a diminishing trade, the chamber pot will persist in bedrooms for longer than you might expect, because the gap between infrastructure progress and individual household practice is always longer than the infrastructure progress alone suggests. The women in the factories will get shorter working hours eventually and better facilities. Eventually. Not because anyone decided the facilities mattered, but because the organisation of labour became powerful enough to demand them, and because the management of this particular problem for women working in industrial conditions was finally seen as a condition of employment rather than a personal problem to be solved privately. Eventually, the knowledge will continue to travel the way it always has, between women in the telling, in the specific directness of your auntie saying there are things you need to know, you someday saying the same thing to someone who needs to hear it. But that's later. Right now it is August of 1876, in a terraced house in Bayswater with the windows open to the warm evening and the sounds of the city outside, and the husband at the writing table, and the book in your hands, and the corset doing what it does, and the bustle sitting where it sits, and the daily machinery of being a woman in 1876 running on its usual schedule, which is always continuously underneath everything, and you are managing it the way you always manage it, with the knowledge that was given to you and the practice of years and the particular competence of someone who has been doing this long enough that the management is no longer something she thinks about very much. She just does it. She does it every day. And at the end of every day, she takes the £18 off and breathes. The book is good. The evening is warm. The husband finishes his letter and sets down the pen and stretches his arms and looks across the room at you and doesn't say anything because nothing needs to be said. The August night is settling. The gas lamp outside the window makes a small circle of orange in the dark. London continues its business. It is always continuing its business. The sound of it familiar and particular, and somehow both immense and intimate. The way sounds become when you've listened to them long enough. You turn a page. Let the evening go at its own pace. Let the warmth of August hold the room. Let the body do what it does, quietly, continuously, managed without thought, while the mind is somewhere else entirely. Let the day wind down through its last hour, the sounds diminishing, the light from the gas lamp steady in the window, the book's world and the room's world coexisting in the comfortable way of the evenings. You are fed enough, warm enough, safe enough, in a room that is yours, in a city that is enormous and sometimes difficult and occasionally extraordinary, with a person who listens, with knowledge that was given to you, with the daily competence of someone who knows how things work. That is enough. More than enough. The book, the evening, the open window and the London night. Let it be enough. Let it be exactly what it is. An ordinary evening in an ordinary life, managed with the same quiet expertise that millions of women before you brought to the same ordinary evenings, in their own homes, in their own clothing, with their own versions of the same daily problem and the same daily solution. Not heroic, not dramatic, not in any portrait, just real, just true, just happening all the time underneath everything. Let that be what stays with you as you close the book. Let the August evening close around it. Let the sounds of the city be the last thing. The sound of a city that is always going, always moving, always managing the gap between what it is and what it pretends to be. Not so different in the end from what you do every morning, putting on the £18. The gap between the surface and what the surface costs. You know the cost. You've always known. Good night.